Okay, guys, so we've actually reached the final subtopic of attachment. So, this is actually the end of the topic. It feels very strange having taught the entire thing virtually through remote learning, but there you go. Um, so, if you want to have a little look at your copies of the topic planner, so that's the one with all the arrows on, you'll have a look through and you can see that we've kind of covered everything now. This will be the last thing. So if that's something that you use for revision to kind of tick off when you've revised it, or to use it to sort of rate yourself on how confident you feel on each of the topics, then that would be a good thing to do. So what we're going to be looking at today is the effects of early attachment on childhood and adulthood relationships. So this is all about looking at attachment types. So we've come across attachment types before when we looked at the strange situation, and it's all about how that could potentially affect relationships later in life. So whether that be in childhood, so things like friendships with peers, but also sort of more romantic relationships in adulthood as well. So, we're going to be looking at the role of the internal working model. You know about the internal working model from Bowlby's theory of monotropy. That was the sort of template, the foundation for future relationships. So that's kind of where it fits in here with this topic. And something called the continuity hypothesis. So we'll look at that in a second. We're then going to be looking on to some research into the effects of on adulthood relationships, and then you guys are going to be doing your own little bit of research, finding out some studies looking at the effects that attachment types can have on childhood relationships as well. So it kind of starts off with, again, it's very sort of Bowlby type theory in terms of, special relationship with the mother. If you don't have it, you have maternal deprivation. If you then have a poor attachment type because of that deprivation, that could lead to later issues later on. So this is kind of the later on part. So you've got the sort of attachment that you initially have with your parents. We know that that can be either secure or insecure. That then has a knock-on effect to your relationship that you have with your friends, and that will then also be a foundation in terms of a blueprint for your romantic relationships as well. So the theory is kind of that they should, or they kind of reflect each other. Um, so the first attachment that we form is typically the one that we show throughout our life with everyone that we have relationships with. Okay. So the continuity hypothesis, basically what that means is, so obviously the word continuity means it will continue throughout life. So children's attachment types are reflected in their later relationships, and it's based upon the internal working model. So any support, any strengths that you found from looking at the theory of monotropy for the internal working model, you can use that for this subtopic as well. So anything that's going to add credibility or validity to the internal working model, because essentially that is what the continuity hypothesis is about. So there will be a reflection between early attachment experiences and later relationships, and it also appears that attachment styles and the quality of adult romantic relationships, there seems to be some sort of correlation between those. So we're going to look at that as well. You don't have to do this, but I did put it in there because it is quite fun to do. If you follow that link, you type that link into Google, you can actually find your romantic attachment style. And if you think that that style is similar to the attachment that you had as a baby in terms of secure, insecure, then that's kind of what this theory is suggesting, that they should be the same. By all means, it's not obviously going to be 100% accurate, it's just like a fun little quiz. But if you were interested in doing that, then there is the link. So the results are, if you completed that quiz, secure and happy means very similar to the secure attachment type that we saw from Ainsworth and the strange situation. Cool and dismissive indicates insecure avoidant as a child, and intense and preoccupied would indicate insecure resistant. But again, by no means those results would be accurate, so don't stress if you do it and you get sort of insecure resistant. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. It's not exactly the most scientific quiz, but anyway. So that quiz is largely based off research that we're going to look at by Hazen and Shaver. So they designed a study to look at the internal working model and to see if there was any relationship or correlation between the attachment type that you have as a child, so secure, insecure, avoidant, insecure, resistant, and the adulthood attachment types in terms of romantic relationships. So they called it the Love Quiz. I want you to have a little research of the Love Quiz. It's quite a straightforward procedure and findings and conclusions. So if you use, the normal kind of resources that you use, Tutor2U, Simply Psychology, or the attachment booklets, I would like you to create a little mind map of the quiz. So on the mind map, I just want you to put kind of over here, aim, what were they trying to achieve, procedure, what did they do, some results, conclusions, and then just a couple of extra bits. So it could be about the participants or the sample, the experimental design, any of that, like just a little bit of information about the actual study, okay? So I will summarise the quiz for you. So hopefully you've done that mind map, so you've got quite a bit of information about the quiz, or the Love Quiz. So the aim of this study was to find out whether romantic love among adults showed the same attachment styles as those found between children and their parents in terms of being secure or insecure. So they basically had a survey that they put in a newspaper, and they called it the Love Quiz. And the first 620 responses were analysed, and 42% of participants were married and 31 were dating. So it asked questions about issues like fear of closeness, abandonment, jealousy, and obsessive preoccupation. And then these were the findings. So they analysed all the responses for the questions, and they concluded that the attachment styles were very similar to that of the strange situation from Ainsworth's research. So securely attached, they tended to be people that responded with answers that were came across as healthy and wanting to be close to somebody, but also wanting independence. Avoidant adults tended to avoid closeness and be very independent, but disliked relying on others. And then you've got anxious, so this were the sort of resistant types, came across quite clingy and insecure and quite uncomfortable with independence. And from the sample, the findings were actually 56% were deemed as being secure, 25 were deemed as being avoidant, and 19 were deemed as being anxious. So if you have a look at those, it actually doesn't seem too dissimilar from the kind of findings that you would get typically from looking at the strange situation in infants. I think there's probably a lot more secure. So I think for strange situation it was sort of 70% secure, 20% avoidant, and 10% anxious. So in conclusion, the findings, yes, they are similar to Ainsworth's findings, maybe potentially a little bit less secure, but pretty similar. So what does that suggest? Does that add credibility to Hazen and Shaver's research? Does it add credibility to the internal working model? So what sort of things does it suggest? However, you've got to consider, are these findings valid in terms of the method? So they were looking at trying to meet this aim of seeing if there was a correlation between early infants attachments and adulthood attachments, but have they actually met the aim? So think about how they actually did it. Did they actually assess the adults when they were children? So do they actually know if they had the same one as they did whilst they took the quiz as an adult? And then have a little think about how potentially you may have redesigned the study to make it a bit more valid, so a bit more accurate in lines with the aim, and also more reliable. So what about the participants that they used? Did they use enough, or did they use a good enough sample? So think about all of those sorts of things, and you can put all of that, any notes that you make from this, you can put into your evaluation of the study. So these are the sorts of things that you should have potentially come up with. So weaknesses. One of the issues is that it didn't really test continuity, because continuity means that they would have had to test the exact same participants as infants and then tested them again as they were an adult. but they didn't actually do that. They only really assessed them as adults, and didn't actually look at all at the infant attachments. They also used self-report measures, so they had a survey, like a questionnaire type thing, to assess the attachment. That's not always going to be the most accurate. You may get people that fall subject to social desirability bias, so this is when they may select answers that they think make them look good, or they don't want to look bad, so they might not be entirely truthful. Also, questions asked them about their childhood, it might not be accurate because they might not remember. So, it was so long ago, it's not the most reliable method, what they've done. Also, the participants were all volunteers, so they had 620 people, but they all kind of self-selected, and you typically get a very specific type of person that will answer ads in newspapers. You're even going to get people that read newspapers at a certain type, so you're not going to get a very generalizable or fair representative sample by putting an ad out in a newspaper and just seeing who's going to answer it. You're going to get a very specific kind of individual that will do that. It also was supposed to be a correlational study, and the issue with correlations is it doesn't show cause and effect. So there's so many variables that can occur between infancy and adulthood that could affect relationships and attachments and all that. So it's not really going to say that definitely causes the adulthood attachment. So it's issues there with causality. Strengths. So a good thing is that there have actually been some other studies that have been similar to Hazan and Shaver's Love Quiz. So McCarthy did another study looking at women and found that the women that were deemed to be securely attached when they were infants had typically the most long-term and enduring romantic relationships as adults, indicating that they were secure in both contexts, whilst anxious avoidance, so these are the kind of resistant types, had the most short-lived and the least intense relationships. So again, indicating that those two are mirrored in terms of the continuity hypothesis. Again, this was only conducted on women, and again, you never know about whether that is reliable or accurate. So you could get some gender bias there. They haven't actually looked at men, and it could be different, for example. Okay, so what I would like you to do now is the same sort of thing. So we've just looked at adulthood relationships in terms of the research, the Love Quiz, and looked at what that was suggesting. There's a couple of research studies now looking into the effect that early attachments types in childhood can actually influence relationships in terms of friendships, peer groups, etc. So whether as a baby, if you were deemed as secure, would you therefore have healthy and secure friendships that are, healthy and lasting and positive? Or if you were resistant as a baby, does that mean you're more likely to be someone that might be a bully or someone that's very clingy or attention seeking or something like that? So I want you to research those two studies and summarise the method, so what they did, so the procedure, the findings of those studies, and then summarise some of the conclusion points to those. And then finally I want you to just think about these questions. Some of these I've discussed earlier on in the PowerPoint, so issues with validity, things like that, but I want you to have a little look at these points, and you can use any reliable sources like the ones that you normally use to have a look at those evaluative points. I want you to make sure for this particular topic or subtopic you've got at least 4 Peel paragraphs. So it could be that you have, for example, that one of those weaknesses or 2 of those weaknesses in Peel format, a strength in Peel format, and then a couple of these, 1 or 2 of those. You don't need 4 Peel paragraphs for the adulthood one and then 4 separate ones for the childhood studies. They all are part of the same subtopic. So if you were to get a 16-mark question on early attachments and the influence of relationships, it would ask you to write about childhood and adulthood. So you don't have to have like 8 Peel paragraphs in total, but 4 in total between the two. Okay.